Good morning, students. My name is teacher Angela and I will be your teacher for today's English class. The topic of this class will be comparison of adjectives. Значи ученици, на днешниот час по англиски јазик ќе стане збор за компарација на придавките и по завршувањето на овој час вие ќе треба да ги препознавате и разликувате степенуваните форми на придавките, компаратив и суперлатив, и правилно да ги формирате и употребувате во вашето изразување. So, let's start. What is an adjective? An adjective is a word that describes the noun. There are three forms of comparison: positive, comparative, and superlative. Comparative adjectives compare two things or people. For example, the blue mug is bigger than the red mug. Please note that the comparative adjective ends in er and is followed by than. Superlative adjectives compare one thing or person with all other things or people in the group. For example, the blue mug is the biggest. Please note that in superlative forms, we use the article the followed by the adjective ending in est. There are several rules we need to follow when forming the comparative and superlative forms of the adjectives. These depend on the letters in the word and the number of syllables. For one-syllable adjectives, the rule is to add the ending er for comparative and est for superlative form. So in our example, we have long, comparative form will be longer, and superlative longest. Next rule is for adjectives ending on vowel plus consonant. For these types of adjectives, the rule is to double the last consonant of the word and then to add the endings er and est. In our example, we have fat, that becomes fatter in comparative, and fattest in superlative. For one-syllable adjectives ending in e, the rule is to remove the letter e from the positive form of the adjective and then to add the endings er for comparative and est for superlative form. We have large, larger in comparative, and largest in superlative. For one-syllable adjectives that end in y, the rule is to remove the letter y and replace it with the letter I and then to add the usual endings er for comparative and est for superlative. In our example, we have early, then earlier for comparative, and earliest for superlative. For two syllables adjectives, the rule is that we have two ways for forming comparative and superlative. The first one is the usual one, when we add er for comparative and est for superlative form. And the second way is to add more before the positive form of the adjective to form the comparative and most to form the superlative form. Through examples, gentle will become gentler or more gentle in comparative, and gentlest and most gentle in superlative. Next, we need to mention the 3 or more syllables adjectives and to know that the rule is to add more for forming the comparative form of the adjective and most for forming the superlative form. So we have expensive, which becomes more expensive in comparative and most expensive in superlative. At the end, we have some irregular forms of adjectives that do not follow the rules. So we can mention good, that will become better in comparative and best in superlative. Also another example, bad, that becomes worse for comparative and worst for superlative. Now, let's go through examples with sentences for each rule. The first rule, for one-syllable adjectives. As we mentioned, we add er for comparative and est for superlative form. Comparative example. Vardar is longer than Bregalnica. Superlative form. Vardar is the longest river in Macedonia. As we can see, we used the ending er for comparative and est for superlative. Next rule was for adjectives ending on a vowel plus consonant. Let's remember, we are doubling the last consonant and then we add the ending er and est for forming the comparative and superlative forms of the adjective. Let's go through sentence examples. Comparative. My dog is fatter than Mia's. Superlative example. Joey's dog is the fattest. Next, we mentioned the one-syllable consonant adjectives that end in e. As we mentioned, we remove the letter e at the end of the word and then we put endings er for comparative and est for superlative forms of the adjective. Example sentences for comparative. The elephant is larger than the cat. Superlative example. The whale is the largest animal. For one-syllable adjectives that end in y, the rule was to remove the letter y, replace it with I, and then we add the ending er for comparative and est for superlative. Sentence examples. I woke up earlier than my sister. This is the comparative form. Superlative. My mom woke up the earliest. As we mentioned before, the two syllables adjectives have two ways of forming the comparative and superlative forms. The first one is the usual one, to add er and est at the end of the word, and the second one is to add more before the adjective for comparative and most before the adjective for superlative form. This will be clearer through sentence examples. So we have two examples for each comparative and superlative forms. Comparative. Cats are gentler than dogs. Or cats are more gentle than dogs. For superlative, cats are the gentlest animals. Or cats are the most gentle animals. The next rule was on 3 or more syllables adjectives, where we put more or most to form the comparative or superlative form. The comparative: my laptop is more expensive than my phone. And superlative: my house is the most expensive thing I've bought. Last but not least important are the irregular forms of the adjectives. We mentioned good and bad. Good becomes better in comparative and best in superlative, and bad becomes worse and worst. Sentence examples: I am a better dancer than Mario. This is a comparative example. Sanya is the best at cooking. This is a superlative example. At the end of this class, I would like to ask you to open the link before and do the exercises for homework. Please check your answers.